Hello, welcome to week number 12 of my week at the club. And this week is the fourth round of the club annual championship at the Wachusett Chess Club. And in this game, I played against Paul Godin, who had the black pieces. I was white. And we both had virtually identical ratings at about 1945 plus or minus 1. And it was quite an interesting game, I thought, and we're playing on board 2. I'm tied for the lead with Ray Paulson, you might recall, and so I'm trying to keep my streak going here up into the last round. So in this game, it started out with d4. That's what I played. Paul responded with knight f6. Played c4, he played e6, knight f3, and b6. So this is a similar setup what I had a couple weeks ago in round 1 against Arthur Barlas. It's a Queen's Indian, and black obviously is either fianchettoing the bishop or bringing it out to a6 to possibly cause problems with putting pressure on my center. I countered the same way I did in that game, which is by fianchettoing my own light-squared bishop. And we both went ahead and fianchettoed. He played c5, which is a more active move, I think, than the d5 that we saw in the other game. And I thought for a while about this, decided that I didn't really want to trade that pawn. I thought about pushing the pawn forward to d5, and kind of eliminated, I think, without giving it enough thought, because it just looks like I'm losing a pawn here. It's attacked 3 times and only defended twice rather, once by my pawn and once by the queen. But this is actually a tactical variation that's playable, because after he plays, if he did play pawn takes pawn, then I play knight to h4, and then I have this pin along that long diagonal. And it actually can be several moves before I recapture on d5. I can develop my knight out and so on, eventually recover that pawn under favorable circumstances. So that was quite playable. And of course, the most normal continuation in this position is just to go ahead and castle. And I didn't do that, but instead defended the pawn with e3, and that's a little cautious, I think. It blocks in my dark squared bishop. It is not a terribly active move, but it felt to me at the time like it was solid. But even that is probably not true, because Paul was able to reply right away, attacking my center with a d pawn. So now we have this funny formation of pawns that you see sometimes in queen pawn openings, where there's a lot of pawn tension and it can be taken in either way, and very often this resolves itself into an isolated d pawn, as it did in this game. I looked for quite a while in this position at knight e5. It has the advantage that it defends that c pawn, which needs defending. The problem is that it's I was just feeling too exposed on my queen side. I've hardly developed any pieces, and here I am moving the knight a second time. And it would be very easy in this sort of situation to have black all of a sudden make a couple moves and get a very active attack against white's king. So I didn't like that. I wanted to develop the piece. So instead I went ahead for developing the knight to c3. And with the idea, I should point out that back here that the c pawn is under attack, and it have to do something about that c pawn. I could either exchange it off for black's d pawn, or I could defend it with my b pawn, or I could do what I did do, which is to go ahead and play the knight out with the idea that after he takes the pawn with d takes c4, which he did, I can come out check and recover it with my queen. Now, interestingly, with this check, he part of the idea behind the check that I had was that I wanted to maybe get the knight to develop to a less advantageous square, because it seemed like the knight really wants to be developed onto c6 in this variation, and it wasn't clear to me that he would want to do that here, pinning it. So instead, we jumped ahead a bunch of moves there. Okay, instead, after the check, he blocked with his knight. And that's kind of interesting, that knight on d7, because it turns out that it stays there a long time in the game, and it's actually quite a, it's kind of a long-term liability for black on that square. And it didn't have to be. There were some lines where it could have developed out through f6, but that was not the case. And it ended up being stymied by my pawn sitting on d4, which takes away two of its natural development squares. So it actually served its purpose, I guess, in that sense, from my point of view. I took the pawn. Then Paul went ahead and exchanged pawns here. Now, I can recapture that pawn three different ways, with the knight, the pawn, or the queen. The problem, of course, with the knight is that the knight is pinned, and I would lose my bishop on b2, or on g2 rather. Don't want to do that. I could take with the queen, but if I take with the queen, then his bishop can very naturally develop out to c5, attacking my queen on d4, and that would cause my queen to move again, and I would lose further time, and he'd be able to castle, and that did not look like a good position for me either. So I think c takes d4 is, maybe not absolutely forced, but the only real reasonable plan here for white. And the problem is it gives that isolated d pawn on d4 that can be a weakness, often is a weakness, because it's got no pawn to defend it. On the other hand, sometimes it can be a strength as well, because it almost always comes along with improved mobility for the side that has that isolani, that has that isolated pawn. The bishops, you notice, can come out easily in this case. And if that pawn is free to move, at some point it can go up to d5 and maybe become a important attacking piece. In this particular position, that's not the case, because Paul's able to blockade it immediately. Actually, he doesn't do it quite immediately. He plays rook to c8 first, and I had to retreat with my queen. Again, here I thought about the best square for my queen. I was tempted to play the queen over here to a4, but the problem with that is that he could then just attack me with his bishop, and if I were foolish enough to go ahead and grab the pawn on a7, then he plays rook to a8, and now my queen is lost. So that definitely wouldn't be a line I'd want to go into. And so instead, after he attacked my queen, I just have to retreat it further, and that didn't appeal to me. So instead, I played the queen after the rook attacked it on c8. I played the queen down to e2. Paul continued to develop, actually, with bishop e7, so he didn't blockade the pawn immediately. So I did have a window, although I don't have d5 sufficiently under control now to be pushing the pawn. I went ahead and castled. He castled. And I played rook e1. That's probably a reasonable square. If I played rook d1, he would do what he did anyhow, which is to blockade the d-pawn with his knight, and now that pawn isn't going anywhere. And unfortunately, if I trade the knight off, he can recapture with the bishop here on d5, and he gets a lovely outpost for the bishop. So it's definitely not a continuation that appealed to me. So after he played the knight to d5, I have a few different options here. I was thinking about, typically one often does in a situation like that, is then instead of exchanging immediately, you can play your knight to e4. But I didn't really have any useful squares that were being attacked by my knight on e4, so I didn't like that plan. Meanwhile, he's attacking my knight twice with his knight and the rook, and I have to do something about that knight that's attacked, either move it or defend it. So I chose to defend it with the bishop on d2, which I think is an okay move. But then he played knight b4, and now there's starting to be a few threats here in the position for black, and black has a small advantage. Black can, if I don't do anything, he can come into c2 with a knight and fork my two rooks. I don't want to have that happen, of course. And about this time I started to worry about the bishop making an appearance on a6 and attacking my queen along that diagonal. But I sort of mistakenly thought, oh, I'll just move my queen away and that won't be an issue. So what I did was to play the rook to c1 to keep the knight from coming in and forking. And then after bishop to a6, I looked for a while and realized that, gee, I really can't get away with moving the knight anywhere, because his knight would come in and fork my rooks on d3, because it would be defended by the bishop and my queen wouldn't be able to take it. He'd just take back with the bishop. So that is not a good line. And I looked at it for quite a while and finally figured out that the move that looked really risky was actually the only move. It was box. I didn't really see the strength of this move until after I was kind of forced to look at it a little more carefully, because you don't really like to pin your pieces to the queen that way, and especially pieces that are hanging out there in the middle of nowhere that can be seemingly attacked easily. But I realized if push came to shove, I could always play the a pawn up to defend it on a4, and at worst I would get maybe doubled pawns, or I might have to capture back with the queen. But the point is that it may be pinned, but there's no piece that he can easily maneuver to attack it again that would cause me to lose it. There's no pawns that can threaten it. The only pawn is the a pawn, and it's blocked by his bishop that's doing the pinning. So temporarily I'm safe at any rate. And he, in this position, went ahead and took the pawn on a2, which is very much a poison pawn. And at this point, evaluation from Stockfish's point of view went from plus 1/10 of a pawn for white to 2.1 pawns for white. So it's a loss of 2 pawns basically. And that's because he ends up losing the exchange out of this sequence, or actually rook for 2 pieces. So what happens is I attack the knight, and now he has to retreat the knight. The little interlude of bishop takes b5 doesn't really help, because I just take back with the queen, and now he still has the same problem with the knight. So he moves back with the knight, and I can capture the knight. He takes back with his bishop, and now I pick up the bishop that's loose on a6. So basically the germs of the position were that there were 2 undefended pieces here, on the knight on a2 and the bishop on a6, and it was easy to skewer the knight to the bishop, and I would win one or the other of them. So in this line, after I take the bishop, it's true he can take my rook, but it's been an exchange of the rook for 2 minor pieces, which is definitely very much in white's favor. After that, I have to recapture the bishop on e1, and the question is how best to go about doing it, because I could take it with the queen, or I could take it with the knight. And if I take it with the queen, that lets his rook come down to c2. If I take it with the knight, it would allow his rook to come down to c1. And I was more worried about having my queen on taking it with the queen, because I was afraid my back rank would be weak. So if I took it with the queen, like so, I was thinking that there might be a line something like his rook coming down to c2, I'd snarf a pawn maybe, and then he would double up on the c file, and now he's got immediate threats of pinning my queen to the king. It's true, in that variation there are things like rook takes knight, and it's fairly complicated tactically, and it turns out that with knight d6, Stockfish says that white is perfectly good here, and this is a good line for white. But it looked a little too scary to me. So instead, I went ahead and played knight takes on e1, because I realized after looking at it for a while that that I had nothing to fear from the rook coming down to c1, pinning that knight and operating on my back rank. And the reason is because I can simply drop my knight back, and now the rook is basically trapped behind enemy lines. So this is a tough position for black, but not crucial at this point. The critical mistake actually was the very next move, which was queen to c8. Now, an alternative to that, which I was perfectly happy with, if he came to g5 to try to defend the rook on c1, I could just interpose the f-pawn and chase the queen away, and then play my queen over and collect the rook for the knight, like so. That would have been fine, although he does get a nice check with the d-pawn in, winning the d-pawn. But I can block with the queen, and white's actually quite good here. The other possibility at this point was the best move, which was actually to play knight b8. And the beauty of that move is that my rook has to move, it has to go somewhere. So say I take the pawn on a7, then his queen now is attacking the d-pawn, and he can take the d-pawn. And then that rescues his rook on c1, so it's no longer trapped. So his knight moves, gains a tempo on my rook, and then allows his queen to operate along the d file here and grab the d-pawn. So it's a nice little combination, but neither one of us saw it during the game, but the computer saw it. But after the move he made, the advantage from white's point of view goes from 1.6 pawns up to 4.2. So a big advantage, winning advantage now for white. I went ahead and took the a-pawn. He attacked me, and I dropped the a-pawn, the rook, the a-rook rather, back to a2, thinking I was being fairly clever, because right in this position when it's on a7, if I drop back to a4, he could attack me immediately with his pawn, advancing it. If I went to a3, he could advance a pawn and immediately threaten to fork my rook and knight. So I didn't like those squares, and I thought that going to a2 was a way to be sure that I could collect his rook that's on c1. But the best move was simply was just to go ahead and to take the knight on d7. Because that's, a knight is a knight, and I didn't like, the reason I didn't do this is because I felt my rook might actually get trapped as well. But what I was neglecting was the fact that I own this b7 square, or this bishop is so strong and it controls this b7 square, and it's control if it can't be interrupted, and at any point I can just retreat my rook to b7 as necessary. So I should have just gone ahead and taken his knight. But I did not do that. Instead, I retreated the rook back to a2, which is okay, but not as strong. Paul played queen to d6, attacking my d-pawn, so I defended it, and at the same time am attacking his rook. So now this really forces his reply. Rook takes knight, and queen takes back. And at this point, he should just simply collect the d-pawn with his queen. I'm not quite sure why he played queen b4, hoping for some complications, I think, against my rook and knight over there, but they're pretty solid. It does pin my knight, but there's nothing that's going to, nothing free to attack my knight immediately. Nevertheless, I started to extricate myself somewhat with queen d2. He played his rook to d8, threatening to move his knight, to get his knight out of jail by going either through c5 or e5, making use of the pin on the d file. And, whoa. Sorry, a little technical difficulties here. So after his rook played to d8, I responded with my rook to a8. It's supported by my bishop on g2, and it pins his rook, so it stops all this counterplay coming along the file immediately. If the knight moves to one of these squares, I'll play rook takes rook check is what I'll do. I could play pawn takes knight, but I would play rook takes rook, because that's leading to just about the checkmate, winning the queen. So he wouldn't do that. So it really, at this point, he should have just traded the rooks off. Instead, he interposed the knight. The problem with that is that then I can play my queen to f4 and attack that knight a second time with the queen and the rook. And his response is forced, where he has to drop back and defend it. I looked briefly at the line for him of coming down and taking my b-pawn and seeing whether or not this looked dangerous. But then I could just simply respond, rook takes knight, and he can check my king, and it looks like it's dangerous, but I can block with the bishop, and that bishop is solid. There's nothing that is going to win it, and meanwhile I've got a winning attack on his back rank. So it's he couldn't go into this line. So instead he played the queen back to f8 to support that knight a second time. I played my, whenever you have a situation like this, you want to get your queen more activated and into the position, so I invaded at c7. He came over and chased my queen off of the c file, but that just allowed me to take the b pawn. Then he made Luft for his king, but the problem is it's going to be very hard for him to unwind his back rank, because of not only is his king there, but his queen is also there, and so it takes, and I have the knight attack twice, so it's very hard to move things off of the back rank while keeping everything defended. This is a safety move for me. Maybe it's not absolutely necessary, but I wanted to take out all future worries about back rank mates. As followers of my channel know, from time to time I've fallen prey to problems on the back rank, and this gives my king a very safe haven on h2. He played his king forward. I brought my knight into the game because now we have these weak dark squares in around the fianchettoed position, and I had started to have visions of queen and the knight invading on those squares. He played his knight to d7, and that was fine with me. I kind of was hoping that he would do that, because my response was just to take the rook. And now if he takes my queen, I take his queen, and he gets the rook back. So we've traded rooks and queens, but the knight and pawn endgame, well, it's actually knight and bishop against knight, and with extra pawns is totally won. So I was perfectly happy to trade off the major pieces. It turned out he didn't take my queen. Instead, he went ahead and took my rook, keeping the queens on the board. So there's a little more play left in the position. My queen was under attack, so I maneuvered it to a safe square, and also one where I might think about checking on e5 here at some point. Also keeping an eye on his knight. He activated his queen a little bit. I moved my knight, threatening to trade off the knights. He moved to where I couldn't trade them off. I attacked his queen and also threatened a fork on e6, which, depending on what square he goes to, could be a problem, or it could at least win a pawn. So he went where he defended that pawn. But then I played b2 to b4, starting my b pawn in motion, because it's going to be very easy to push that pawn forward and get a queen. That was basically the plan at this point. And if he wanted to stop it, he'd have to allow me to trade queens off, or queens and knights or whatever. But I control those squares on the b file, and it'll be easy to push that pawn forward. He brought his knight back, I think, to try to help to end the defense there, but it's hopeless at this point. I played my queen in to try to force a queen trade, and he tried to duck the queen trade, but I'm able to play knight takes pawn check in that case, because now his f-pawn was pinned. His king came up attacking my knight, and it turns out that here, if I play g4, there is actually after this move, there's a checkmate and 10 moves, well, 9 more moves according to Stockfish, but I didn't want to analyze that out. Instead, it was very simple in my mind just to go ahead and fork the queen and the king and thereby force a queen trade. And then I have that end game that I talked about before of knight and bishop and some passed pawns against a knight, which is trivial to win. So after I played queen d8 check, Paul threw in the towel. So it was a fun game for me. It was kind of difficult for Paul. He got to the point where he just didn't have that much that he could do because of the way his pieces were set up on the back rank. And it made it, fairly easy for me to go ahead and do the technical conversion of the win once I'd won some material. So we're going to be down to the last week. I'm still, Ray Paulson won this week as well. And so Ray and I both have 3.5 out of 4 points. And we won't be playing each other because we already did. That's where we both drew. And so we're each playing someone else. And I'm playing Ken Gurge this week, who I've played multiple times. I'll have black again. And he's had white in 4 out of our 5 games. But he's been a tough opponent for me. He's drawn 3 out of the 5 games. And I've won the other 2, which is tough in the sense that it's a little worse than our rating differential would predict. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to do a little better this week, but we'll see. So until a few days from now, so long, and hope you enjoyed this episode. Good night.